In this video, I'm going to go over some of the vocabulary we use to describe exploratory designs. This figure comes from the Portney and Watkins textbook, and it shows some of the different kinds of exploratory research studies. We've gone over some of this vocabulary in earlier videos: prospective versus retrospective studies, cross-sectional versus longitudinal. What we're going to cover in this video is the distinction between one group and multiple group studies, pretest and posttest, and we're going to talk about two specific kinds of exploratory study designs: cohort and case control. One group versus multiple group. Here we're looking at, were all the participants given the same intervention, or did different participants get different kinds of treatments? So in a one group study, all the subjects get the same intervention. In a multi-group study, there's a different intervention given to different groups of participants. Pre-test, post-test versus post-test only. There the distinction is, did we measure the dependent variable at the end of the study, after the intervention was applied, or did we measure the dependent variable both before and after the intervention? In some studies, it's not possible to measure the dependent variable before the intervention. So in the case of something like an employment study, presumably all the participants are unemployed before the intervention, so there's going to be no difference between them before, and there's no point in measuring it before. You're only going to look at employment after the intervention. In other studies, for, say, range of motion, you might measure their passive range of motion before the intervention, apply the intervention, and then measure again afterwards. A case control study design is one specific type of exploratory research design. This is always retrospective, so we're always starting with the outcome and working backwards. So for example, if you work in a lung cancer clinic, you might look backwards at how many of the participants were smokers and how many weren't. Here's one way you might draw up the flow of a case control study design. There's non-random assignment, right? You're starting with all of the participants. You ask which ones had the condition or engaged in the activity. You split them up into two groups, one that engaged in it, one that did not, and then you see if they had lung cancer or whatever it is that the outcome you're looking for. A cohort study design can be prospective or retrospective. And the word cohort in conversational English means a group of people. So the word cohort can get misused in experimental design and in research papers. When we talk about a cohort study design, we mean something very specific. We mean there's a group of people who are together for a particular reason. So maybe they're all smokers and you work in a smoking cessation clinic. You might follow them over the course of their treatment and then see which ones are able to quit smoking and which ones aren't, and match them up with a separate cohort that isn't in your smoking clinic but are still smokers, and see how many of them are able to quit smoking or not. So here's how this design might be drawn up. So you have a pool of subjects, non-random assignment again. Some of the smokers do go to the smoking cessation clinic, some don't. That becomes your experimental and control group, and then at the end of the study you look and see, did they quit smoking or not? So to summarize, cohort can be prospective or retrospective. Case control is retrospective. So in a cohort case, you're looking at people who share some sort of factor. So they may all be smokers. In case control, you're looking at people who have some sort of outcome in common. They may all have lung cancer. You're starting with cohort, you're starting with a big group of people that have something in common. So you're going to need a large group of smokers. In case control, you're probably starting with a much smaller group. You're starting with the small group of people that had the outcome of lung cancer. With a cohort group, you're dividing them into some sort of risk factor or intervention or event. So they got treatment, they tried the patch, they went to smoking cessation classes, or they didn't. Um, in case control, you're looking for people that are similar to the group of people who got your outcome, who got lung cancer, but who didn't get that outcome, who don't have lung cancer. And in a cohort, you're going to compare the outcomes. So all your people are starting as smokers. How many of them get lung cancer? How many don't? In case control, you've got two groups of people that one group has lung cancer, one group doesn't. You look backwards at the risk factors or interventions or events that the two groups either have in common or have differently. So as another example, maybe we're interested in shoulder injury in wheelchair users. One way to do it, to study this, is with a cohort study. So start with a big group of wheelchair users, find out which ones are powered wheelchair users and which ones are manual wheelchair users. So divide your cohort based on what type of wheelchair they use, and then you can prospectively follow them for a year or 5 years or 10 years, see how many in each group get a shoulder injury, or retrospectively, you can grab a bunch of wheelchair users, divide them into power and manual wheelchair users, and then look backwards over the past 5 years how many of them have had shoulder injuries. In a case control study, you would start with a group of wheelchair users who have shoulder injuries, and you would find a matching group of wheelchair users who don't have shoulder injuries, and then look backwards how many of them have used a manual or a powered wheelchair.